just our final topic around definitive agreements is just, the number of other agreements that might be involved, in closing a transaction. So, employment agreements, transition service agreements. Michael, can you comment on these agreements? And are there any other agreements? I mean, I think I've seen, I've definitely seen a few other agreements that are important around, the actual sale and purchase agreement.
Well, the one that's most important is when you're selling to a private equity firm and you're rolling over equity. And so that is a significant, a very, very important agreement that often doesn't get the right attention. So if you're rolling over 25% of your proceeds, very often that agreement becomes almost a secondary agreement. It's really not. It's 25% of your proceeds are being reinvested into this platform company or the private equity firm that's purchasing you. And so you've got to look at valuation of that as well as the shareholder agreement. And very often the shareholder agreement does not provide you with what is known as pari passu or equal rights to the private equity firm, but you don't have governance issues so that you can't prevent certain things from happening. And so that has to be heavily negotiated and make sure it's what you intend to, what the intent is. Do you have the same security? Do you have any minority rights? And that should be done. That's a heavily negotiated agreement that we like to negotiate at the LOI stage for when you have the leverage. So that's I'd say the most important by far. The second one that has a lot of economics around it is a lease, a real estate lease. Very often in our transactions, there's a huge building involved. It's not being purchased, and there's a lease there. And the last thing a seller wants to do, especially if they have a building that's unique or specialized, is to have someone buy the business, enter into a lease, and leave after a year. And now you're stuck with a $50,000 square foot building in the middle of some suburb that you can't lease, very quickly. And so that's kind of, I'll say, a very important second level agreement. You want to do what you want to do. And what we often look at is sale leaseback. So we want the ability to, if we own that lease, to be able to sell that building without the buyer's approval. And then the third, I would say, would be employment agreements. Employment agreements is not only yourself, if you're planning on working, but employment agreements for your key employees. And those are, again, who are they going to buy? Who are they going to hire? What's their deal? If you have a key employee, that key employee could literally hold up a transaction if they want to be hard asses about it. And so it's very important to make sure that you're not only negotiating with the buyer, but also have your key employees lined up. And sometimes that involves giving employees some sort of bonus. And so that would be, I think, a very important agreement. I can go on, but I think those are the three that I would kind of zero in for this discussion.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. Simon, can you add to that, the ancillary agreements that you see? I mean, Michael's made some great points, around those three.
Yeah, I think just to give all those potential sellers out there an idea, private equity transactions do generate significant numbers of agreements. We closed out a deal a few weeks ago, and there were 600 separate documents that the teams needed to sign.
That's not pages, that's documents.
Yeah, that's documents, separate ancillary, the main documents and then ancillary documents. And I think Michael's picked out some key ones. The one that you often find is the most contentious and takes the longest period is the intercreditor agreement. And the intercreditor agreement is setting how the banks can lend their money and make sure that the private equity house, who is also owed money, isn't able to, accelerate the insolvency of the company if, for some reason, the business isn't being paid. The banks want to be able to step in and control all of that process, and the intercreditor agreement is there to give them that protection, but also give the private equity house some protection in terms of information rights and knowing what the bank is going to do, because obviously their equity is at risk. So it's quite a contentious area. And just on the buy side, it's not impacting on the seller, but it's a key document for the buyer. And employment contracts are always, I think Michael pulled out some good distinctions there. I mean, employment contracts, if you're selling shares in the company, they don't need renewing, but the buyer tends to want the employment contracts in a form that they're used to. And, going back 10 years ago, a lot of companies didn't even have employment contracts. You'd be selling and you didn't have the contracts in place, and everything's a lot more professional these days, but there are still nuances in there that the buyer will want to make sure that they've got something that's quite strict around, any product design that's done on company premises by employees, confidentiality, the gross misconduct definition, so that they've got, everything in there that they think is right, a bit belt and braces, if you like. So certainly there are a couple of key other contracts there.
Bill, can you add any contracts you can think of that are ancillary that are important that a seller should be considering?
Sure. No, Simon and Michael obviously did a great job covering the main ones and some great points. Just the lease, just to talk about that for a second, because quite often a business owner also owns the facility, wants to sell the business, says, I will remain as a landlord. I'm happy to get the income from leasing the property. And there you want to make sure that the deal that the landlord has with himself or herself with the business is the same deal that he or she would want to have with a new buyer. And quite often you run into that situation where, well, I'm renting at $100,000 a year, but that's below market. I really should charge $200,000. Well, you need to make sure that, first of all, you made an adjustment going back to when you put the materials together, but make sure that you communicate exactly what that building owner is willing to do with the buyer to make sure that that agreement is the same, or if there's any adjustments that we've adjusted the earnings accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Great point. So Simon, just want to touch back on another point that you made around, the buyer's financing of the acquisition. Like in some cases that also impacts the seller. It might restrict their ability to get paid in the future. So reviewing and understanding what the buyer's financing is and the impact on any potential, repayment of seller notes or earnouts, what impact that might have is important as well.
Actually, that's a really good point. And on a deal we closed on Friday, we got given that undertaking by the US bank that was funding the deal that restricted the payment of the earnout. So even if the company hit the profit targets and had a further substantial payment of £3 million is what's due. The bank suddenly 2 days before completion produced this document that said, they could not pay it if the company was breaching covenants or not performing well. And you may think, well, if it's hit the earnout, then it's hit the target, it must be performing okay. But you could have a situation where it hits that profit target in the first 6 months, and actually, the next 6 months it's hardly making any money, and therefore the company just doesn't have the cash, and it's trending downwards after that. So again, we had US lawyers acting for our vendors in the UK who were able to say, yes, actually this is quite commonplace in the US, even though it isn't in the UK. And we went through and negotiated that. But we did stop it happening on the completion payment balance sheet, which they were trying to capture everything within that document. And we just restricted it to the earnout. So you're quite right. Yeah, I should have made that point.
Yeah, and the financing is always kind of the last thing that gets put in place. So a lot of these issues come up at the 11th hour. So it's definitely important, obviously to have experienced investment bankers like we have here. So guys, that concludes our discussion around definitive agreements. This was a great discussion and really shows and highlights how many things are negotiated in a transaction. It's just not the purchase and sale agreement, but there's so many other ancillary items to negotiate and consider. So thanks for this, guys.